So it basically has three functions: on, off, and pulse. And pulse is just a version of on. And it has like two paddles. We basically press it and you release it. It's very intuitive. Consumers are attracted to it because it does have a classic look. It's simple and easy to use. There's not a zillion bells and whistles. You'll see people try to like just add on and add on and add on to products when that's not necessarily driving value to the consumer. There's certain things that we're working on right now. It's like, okay, we have there's 20 functions available in a toaster oven, but how many people actually using?
Welcome to How I Made It in Marketing from Marketing Sherpa. We scour pitches from hundreds of creative leaders and uncover specific examples. Not just trending ideas or buzzword-laden schmaltz. Real-world examples to help you transform yourself as a marketer. Now, here's your host, the Senior Director of Content and Marketing at Marketing Sherpa, Daniel Burstein, to tell you about today's guest.
Earlier in my career, I would help with earnings calls, and it opened my eyes to the relentless focus on the short term in business and marketing. I mean, just look around. It's quarterly earnings per share guidance, a myopic focus on the current news cycle or real-time marketing, just the people that pour their budget only into the bottom of the funnel in performance marketing. In fact, no less than Warren Buffett and Jamie Dimon wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal with the title, "Short-termism is harming the economy." Come on, we see this in marketing. The average CMO tenure is only 40 months. But our next guest has been marketing at the same company for, get this, 26 years. She's going to tell us about bringing a long-term growth perspective to product launches and how one of the most popular items her brand sells in that category was launched in the 70s. That's just one of the many lessons we're going to hear from Mary Rodgers, Head of Marketing Communications at Cuisinart. Thanks for joining us, Mary.
Thank you for having me today.
Okay, and so let me look at some of your background here. I just usually go through people's LinkedIn real quick. We see earlier in your career, you started as National Sales and Marketing Coordinator at Dansk. You were a marketing manager at Farberware, but then it goes to Cuisinart. And I saw 26 years. That's incredible. And I just kind of was doing a little back of the folder math. So if the average CMO tenure is 40 months, there's probably about like 10 CMOs who don't even last like a year and a half, and you're just kind of bringing up the average for them.
I got to do my best there and help out my friends. So yes, I've been with the company for 26 years. As you can imagine, it's changed dramatically in that time frame, and so has marketing, so has the world. And some of the biggest changes in our business have been around, D2C and e-commerce and some areas of business that are really new to marketing in a way, new-ish in that whole time frame. But my team consists of market research, digital marketing, e-com, D2C, also regular good old brand marketing is in there too. And so I have a pretty deep group of people who help us, and then we have a huge group of agency partners who specialize in specific areas to help support our business for the long term. So, you had asked me when we were prepping for this about, what do I do in a given day? Well, the gamut, as you can imagine. It could be everything from, analyzing data for, a huge study, or it could be something as, thoughtless in some people's mind as reviewing inventory and understanding where our D2C business is going. And so I say the reason I'm still here at Cuisinart is because not one day has been the same in 26 years. And so it's all over the place. Last week we had a gigantic meeting about Amazon Summit, prepping for things like that, prepping for, retailer meetings, presenting marketing programming. It's basically all over, and you have to have a pretty diverse set of skills to be in marketing now, in my opinion. It's not just about, a lot of people, I have young people who work for me, and they say, I thought it was going to be fun, and I didn't realize there's so many numbers involved. I'm like, you're running a business. It's a business, It's not all the fun stuff. There's all the stuff that you have to do to keep the business running for the long term.
There is, but there's some fun stuff too, right? Looks like there's some trophies behind you, or there's some
Oh
trophies
yeah,
behind
there
you.
are.
Yeah.
I had a little bit of fun to get those too. Oh yeah, and my thing of Lysol over there.
So let me tell the folks at home a little bit about your team. So you have a staff of 20 marketing professionals in addition to your creative agency. You manage a $30 million annual budget, and you have helped make Cuisinart the number one high-end housewares brand according to NPD. So nice job. Let's find out how you did that. So let's jump in. Your first lesson you told us about was never give up attitude, resourcefulness, and tenacity are some of the personal characteristics that serve you well no matter what field you are practicing in. And this goes, I think, back to earlier in your career. Tell us what happened.
So one of the really big trade shows in our business in the housewares industry is the International Houseware Show, and I had started working for Dansk like that week, and they wanted me to go to Chicago with them. So I'm like going to this big trade show, and I had no input. I had no real involvement in the setup and the organization of it. And we get to the show, and they had hired a consultant to like do that aspect of the set the show up and get everybody like trained and everything. And we get all the way to the show, and literally nothing showed up, like nothing at all. And I'm like, oh my God, this is my first intro to this company, and I'm like, oh, like, go into survival mode at this point. And so the person I worked for at that time, his name was Jim Frazee. We still keep in contact with each other. He's doing other things now. He's basically semi-retired and moved on to some things that of his interest instead of like real marketing work. But I was, I my first big lesson was like, don't give up. The show must go on. Let's figure out how we're going to do this. We dragged all over Chicago looking for like fixtures and product and, grocery shopping and finding everything that we needed to so that we could still have this really important show. And we had all these new like launch products too. And the funny thing was, I didn't tell you this part, was the one thing did show up, and it was this gigantic toaster that was like, supposed to be like the piece that was going to get people all interested. It was like this. Oh my God, it was the size of a car. So that was like the only thing that did show up, and everything else didn't. So the one thing it did teach me really early on in my career, I was like, I'm not going to say how old I was because then you'll figure out how old I am now. But it really taught me that you could figure your way out of anything. Like someone said to me recently, like you can. There's nothing you can't solve without your brain and money. So I really took that with me along my career, like looking at things from a different way, like never giving up. You know, Sometimes we work on these gigantic projects that have so many variables involved in them that you really have to stay on top of it. Recently, about a year and a half ago, we did a huge overhaul of moving our web property from a PHP site to a custom from a custom PHP site to a best-in-class DXP, and that was a long haul, but we stuck to it, and stayed on top of everything and made it happen. And the site was never down ever. It was like flip the switch, and it there was things we had to clean up afterwards, but there were so many people involved in that and also staying on top of it and being tenacious and never giving up and sticking to the timelines. And that's actually how you get things done. At the end of the day, you can't give up. I mean, because that's how things start to slip, and that's when the train goes off the tracks.
Yeah, I mean, tenacity is such an important watchword in marketing. I guess I probably in really any career. But it's funny, when I read your story, I had a pretty similar experience, and it was also in Chicago. It was at the McCormick, I think, is the
Oh my
big.
God, yes.
Yeah. So I was running the media center at IRCE, which is this big e-commerce event at McCormick, and I was doing the interviews, and nothing showed up. We didn't, our AV production crew, all their cameras and whatever editing stuff they use and all this stuff, like nothing showed up, and so. Fortunately, I was not the only person there, and I can't take, it was our marketing team and our production team and all that. They scrambled like crazy, and they tracked down. It was, some tractor trailer was somewhere where it wasn't supposed to be. It was like the wrong dock or something, because that place is massive, and they got to the right dock. But we got it. like they're literally setting up. Normally we would just have it set up a day before, do run throughs and all that stuff. But literally when we had the first guest show up there, because we were doing, I think, interviews like every 20 minutes for like 3 days of all the different speakers. And so literally when the first speaker was showing up, they were just still wiring stuff around me. And I was just, kind of running through with them. And then right away, it was like at the minute we had to start, it was ready. And, but the thing I took away from it was, and actually, I don't want to get too deep into the Oscars, but this is the thing that surprised me about the Oscars. So, I'm sure everyone knows what happened with Will Smith and Chris Rock, and I won't get into what's wrong or right there. But the thing that surprised me is like the producers didn't seem able to handle it. Like from what I heard, they were like, my wife was telling me, they're like in different parts of the auditorium, they couldn't get together and figure out how to react. And from my experience from event marketing, working on an event, the biggest takeaway is like, stuff's going to happen. And I mean, stuff's going to go wrong. I don't know what that thing's going to be, but stuff's going to happen. And you better have a contingency plan, or at least like a clear set of decision makers, know who can, make the call, and have, like you said, money sometimes too. So have like a backup budget for a contingency, because I don't know what's going to go wrong, but something's going to go wrong. And like you said, the show must go on. So anyone engaged in event marketing, learn from Mary, learn from me, learn from the Oscars, like have a contingency plan in place, right?
Yeah, we had another situation happen. This, when you said it, just reminded me of it. We used to do this thing called Cuisinart College, and we would go around the country and have like I would lecture about like the company history, and we would have cooking classes. And so we were doing one up in Napa, and which is not a horrible thing. See, that's the fun thing right there. It was fun until this happened. So the shipment arrives, and the freight company made a big mistake, and they delivered us this gigantic computer, and the stuff we were supposed to get went to the place the computer was supposed to go. And so somebody who works for me, who was doing the event marketing part of it, like total meltdown. I'm like, get it together. Get it together now, because that's not going to help you get where you need to go, which in some ways sounds like maybe it's not very empathetic, that I'm like letting the person have a meltdown, cry out. But the thing is, at the end of the day, you're putting your energy into the wrong thing. So you're putting your energy into your emotions instead of saying like, let me keep it together. Let me get a hold of somebody. And we did get the stuff, but it took like the entire day for us to, unwrangle that mess that we didn't create ourselves. But I was like, the computer's probably worth a lot though.
We're going to hold it hostage until we get what we need.
Until we get our stuff.
No, you can't. You got to save the meltdown for later. That's what I've learned. Because sometimes when it's done, then it's like, okay, now you can just let all the emotions out. And so we talked about, and in fairness, there is fun to marketing. And if you want to be creative, there's fun part. If you want to get into the event marketing side, you got to have nerves of steel, and you got to be able to roll with the punches no matter what happens. Because again, it's in that moment.
It's funny because I used to handle all the big trade shows when I was at Farberware, and when I came to work for Cuisinart, they're like, our ops team handles all the trade shows. I'm like, great. Oh, I'm so happy. You don't know how happy that makes me. Because you know what? It's a tough job, and there's a lot of thankless parts of it too. When it goes really great, it's like fabulous and nobody notices a thing. But when it goes south bad.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes when it goes really great, people don't know what happened behind the scenes. That went all wrong. But
it's all perception.
Exactly. The front of the house perception, right? So let's talk about your next lesson. Always focus on the needs of consumers. So tell us about this. How do you do that at Cuisinart?
Well, lots of different ways. We use, obviously, research is a big part of it, and also just keeping lines of communications open, because, we get lots of input from our consumers, like through email and through phone calls and through our social media channels. And, we always have to keep them at the heart of what we do, because at the end of the day, we're serving them. And so if we're providing something to them that is of value and it improves their life, that's what's really important to us. At the end of the day, that's what keeps our brand relevant in the consumer's mind.
Right. And so you were telling me, for example, you're engaging in concept testing for a new product, and you learn.
Yeah. So we're always working on, we have so many research projects going on at the same time. One of the ones that we've been working on for, I would say, probably more than 6 months is concept testing. We're always doing testing on our products, when they launch, right before they launch. We also do a lot of work around, research in general, understanding the consumer's needs. But one of the things that we worked on recently was some concept testing for a new product in the air fryer category. And some of the things you learn from consumers are just so intriguing, like the way men think about food that has a lot of fat content versus the way women think about food that has a lot of fat content, and they're at opposite ends of the spectrum. Men are like, the more fat the better, and the women are like, no fat, no fat. And so it was totally interesting to see their perspective on it, that men were like, oh, I don't care if it's swimming in grease, and women are like, oh, no, no grease, and there's a saying in food, it's like fat carries flavor. So it was interesting to see men's perspective on it versus women's, and have them voice it themselves. You know what I'm saying? It's like it's so interesting because so much of communications in marketing and in the food business is about less fat, and so it's almost like they're serving half of the population with some of the messaging there. So I thought that was super interesting.
Well, I think that's a great example too. My background was as a copywriter, is understanding the connotation and denotation of every word you're using to describe your brand. Because as you said, like fat brings flavor, but fat has certain connotation and denotation to people, reading that. And depending on who they are, you could be, sending that's entirely wrong message that you don't want to be sending. So
Exactly. And so like if you're trying to go after like a segment of, let's just make something up, moms with kids under the age of 2 and who are like super concerned about the health of their kids and things like that, and you like come out with a message related to full of fat, full of flavor, that's like a complete turn off to that segment. But to maybe a younger male audience might be the opposite. So it's true, the nuances of it, and how consumers interpret it.
yeah. So when you're saying this, you remind me of I'd written this blog post. The customer is always right, but they're not always right about your product. And I was inspired by it. It was a grocery store up by where you live when I visited up there called Stu Leonard's. Stu Leonard's, yeah. And I remember it was something. It was either like there was this big rock by the front door. There was something where they had like this thing all about the customer and the customer being
Yeah,
right or something
and
like
when
that.
you get to the bottom, you say, go back to step one. The customer's always right. So it's like it was like this iteration, and then it's like if you if you didn't understand the rules, read rule one, which is the customer's always right at the end of the day.
Right. So when I read that, but then I thought, so I don't know if you've ever seen The Simpsons. There's this famous Simpsons where Homer Simpson realizes his brother like owns this car company, and then his brother sees him and he's like, Homer is the everyman. Let's let him design a car. And so he designs a car, and it's just the biggest flop in the world. I think they're comparing it to the Edsel because it's like it plays like La Cucaracha on the when you hit the horn and stuff like this. Because this was this one guy's made up idea of what a fantasy car would be. And so in that blog post, I talk about, the customer is always right. They're not always right about your product. And this is where research comes in, and you have to be careful not to listen to the loudest voices and the edge cases, because sometimes it's really good to listen to the customer, but sometimes it's just the edge case, the most extreme person that's really communicating with you, and they don't represent an addressable market that you can profit from. So I was kind of curious. It sounds like you're engaged in a lot of concept testing, a lot of testing with your customers. Where do you balance that with, okay, what is an actual marketable product versus here's a squeaky wheel or a loud voice? Or sometimes customers don't understand what they want. Like we said with fat, like they think they don't want fat, but then eat something without fat and it doesn't taste good.
So a couple of things there. So interesting about your comment about the loudest voice in the room, basically. So we recently did a round of a whole bunch of focus groups, in-person focus groups, and we had one group that happened in, and the person was a little cynical, and so like the whole focus group got a little cynical, and we're like, I was like, what's going on here? Then they started saying like some really unkind things that hurt my heart, let me put it to you that way. And it was interesting. It was like later in the evening, so I don't know if people are like just like had a full day, and it was like 9:30 at night, and it was a younger group of consumers too. And I was like, oh, that's that's painful. But you're right. You can, we use the focus groups as basically just to inform. Like, what are the things that we want to learn, and then what do we take from that, and then do deeper research, which is very typical avenue when you're doing that type of like big big brand work or big concept work. And so you have to be a little careful too. Like, what are some of the threads that run through all of those people that you've spoken to? And are there differences between the younger and older or different types of consumers? But that's not going to get you to the final place. You know what I mean? It's basically just meant as early learnings. That's how I use it. Like early learnings. Like, I was like interesting to me about how consumers like think about buying products based on their personal living situation. And so, we're not necessarily thinking like that. We're thinking, okay, well, consumers in an apartment, when they move in a home, they have more space, and so therefore they'll buy more things, and so that's not where their mind space is. And so, we do a lot more after that point, in which we do super, these big surveys, and then after these big surveys we go back again and then go speak to smaller groups of users to kind of come to our final conclusion on where we're going with whether it's a concept, whether it's a positioning for a specific product. And we found a lot of success in that process. Let's be honest, we don't do it for every single item. We do it for really important categories, and also like maybe categories that we haven't been in, that we don't have like built-in knowledge on the category. We found a lot of success there.
Okay, and this kind of gets into the next lesson you're talking about. Always look for long-term growth with your product launches, and really kind of you've shown through your entire career you're kind of focused on the long term. So kind of take us through a product launch, and how do you kind of focus on the long term for that?
So it depends on what the product is, but so in certain categories, I'll use air fryers for instance. We had talked about this a little bit earlier, only because it's like right now one of the categories that's fastest growing in our business. And the thing is, there it's like this is a new category hadn't sold in. So at the very beginning, for myself, I was like, okay, how do we position it? What are the needs of the consumer? How can we message it? What messages are important to them? And we use that research, and also because it was a format that hadn't existed before. It was an oven format versus these kind of basket style, what we call basket style air fryers. There was some concerns with our retailers, like where do we put it in the store? You know what I mean? Like, well, if a consumer is looking for air fryers and they go over to look at air fryers, ours is with the ovens, and theirs are not with ours. So we had a lot of decisions to make around those areas, and also just completely understanding the consumer journey, like what was their purchase journey, how did they make decisions, where do they go buy, where they bought, like when we launched the product in 2017 versus now, to completely different universes. The shopping habits of consumers has changed dramatically, but that has been a very successful product for the company. I completely believe, based on the research that we did and understanding the positioning of the product to the consumer. And we also, during that research phase, we also were able to garner enough information from consumers to plan out our long-term category development. So, not just for that moment, like how do we get this air fryer in the market, and how do we position it, and this and that. Is more like, how do we get enough data so that we can plan a future for that line and the product and the advancement of the product. So that's what I talk about, like long-term thinking, and not for the moment. But the other thing too that we had talked about was things like, marketers not thinking for the moment, and not necessarily down the road. And I think it also plays into, like, how long are they going to be committed to the place they're working at the moment. So are they looking to make big hits now and move on to something else, or are they really in it for the long-term growth of the brand and also the business? So I think that that's an interesting perspective too.
Sure. So we're talking about your budget earlier. I'm sure you have to report quarterly earnings or monthly, or there's some sort of results you have to present in the short term. Like, how do you balance your budget to address the short term and the long term? Do you split it up of like, okay, it's 80% to the short term, but hey, we got this 20% where we're just going to totally focus on the next 10 years and building out a category and branding? And is there kind of a way you chop it up?
Well, right now, believe it or not, the way that we do it is we have like overall brand, which we call like evergreen, the stuff that's evergreen that we're constantly doing and constantly working on. And then we have the parts of the budget that are focused on key products and key product launches. So it's a combination of both. And then layered onto that, we have a separate cost center for D2C and e-commerce. So those kind of work hand in hand because, you're still, working on driving the brand, but for the direct to consumer business, it's a lot easier to gather data and statistics and kind of understand that on like a day-to-day basis. That's how we look at it. So we plan, on a calendar year, and then we break it up into quarters. And then what we do is we calendar out all the channels that we're working in, and then if there's a product focused, if it's a brand focused, and then basically map that all out on a calendar. And then we also share that out to management and also to our sales teams because we have a combination of internal and external sales. And we share that out so that they can also plan accordingly so that they're also maximizing in the marketplace at the same time we are. Because if we can get all of our retailers focused on the same things that we're doing in the marketing space, that we actually will maximize the brand in the total market. And so it's also a way of extending the value of what we're doing.
Yeah, getting your partners there along with you.
Yeah,
So
exactly. That's not as easy as it sounds, though.
I bet they've got their own agendas, right?
Well, they do, but the thing is, like, we also are focused on, like, distribution and growth and all those things that tie back into the marketing planning part of it. So it makes it exponential if we can get them rallying around the same efforts that we're making in the marketplace. It's better for growth for both parties.
Right. Right. Then let me ask you, so we talked about before, like, okay, launching a new product like the air fryer segment, but you had mentioned that the number one selling product in a category was a product that launched in the 1970s for Cuisinart, and still the number one selling product in that category. I think it was a food processor maybe. And so I would think that that is kind of a different challenge of taking that same product and still trying to make it relevant to an audience today. And we think that's a whole different type of research and a whole different type of marketing, because obviously you talked about how we were different in 2017, which is very true because of COVID. Well, we were very different in 1972 also. And all the time. So what do you, when you have like a kind of long-term legacy product like that, how do you approach the marketing or the research differently, or do you?
Yeah, it happens to be the food processor category. So interestingly, the lesson here learned is that sometimes simplicity is the best choice for consumers. So products that we made, that the product I'm speaking to it's very classic, has a classic look. It has a simple operating platform. So basically has three functions: on, off, and pulse. And pulse is just a version of on. And it has like two paddles. We call them paddles, but basically you press it, you release it. It's very intuitive. And so I personally believe that it's it's basically also one of our super iconic looks, and consumers are attracted to it because it does have a classic look. It's simple and easy to use. There's not a zillion bells and whistles. Like sometimes, you'll see people try to like just add on and add on and add on to products when that's not necessarily driving value to the consumer. And there's certain things that we're working on right now. It's like, okay, we have how many? There's 20 functions available on a toaster oven, but how many people actually using? And so at the end of the day, they're not using 20. You know, and so you have to kind of keep those things in mind. And I really believe that's why that product is so well loved. It's been in the market for a long time. It has great reviews. It has lots of editors love the product. You always see it placed in lots of scenes in like cooking shows and segments and things like that. The thing about that product too is that it's beautifully constructed. So the physical construction of it, the quality of the finish, and also the implements in it, it's actually beautifully made too, and that's why it stood the test of time. And it's just, consumers just love it because it's simple and easy to understand and use. And at the end of the day, I believe that's why it's still a top selling item in our portfolio. But in the category, it is the top selling item.
It's really interesting you mentioned that. When I mentioned to my wife that I was going to talk to you, she's like, "Oh yeah, we have a Cuisinart food processor." And now that you mentioned it, I have used it, and it's just that lever, and it's those three things. But we bought a washing machine like 6 months or a year ago, and the washing machine has AI, like it brags about that, and there's also an app you can get with it and stuff. And so I was trying to tell my wife, because it's the shiny objects. I'm always like, "Oh, put the app on your phone," and blah blah. And she's just like, why would I want an app from the washing machine? I don't need an app. And I think marketers can be kind of the same way. We're always looking at the shiny object syndrome, right? It's the metaverse and it's TikTok and whatever. And I was in recent podcast episode, I was interviewing the CMO of Mint Mobile, and they've had success in the newspaper print advertising. And so I think it's kind of something to really think about as marketers when we're doing our media plans, or if we're kind of advising and helping on products. It doesn't always need to be the shiniest new object, like you said. What strikes me now when I think about that food processor, it is easy to use. It's just up and down, My washing machine has so many settings. I don't even know what most of them do, so.
Yeah, I agree with you there because, that's a conundrum in our business in general, in the durables business. Smart, just to say it's smart, is it smart? Is it adding value for the consumer? And the other thing with smart is somebody has to pay for smart. It just doesn't happen. And the business that we're in is inelastic, and so you have to be super conscious about like the way you price your products and things like that. And as you know, like what's going on in the market in general right now is like pretty tough. Just between all of the supply chain issues and raw material cost increases and labor shortages and fuel costs, and there's a lot of things going on out in the marketplace that make it really important on how you price your products to consumers. And so I was actually reading a really interesting article about this yesterday too, about delivering value to consumers. But the thing is that I think that pricing in and of itself is interesting right now, because with that, and then adding smart onto it, it has to have a purpose, and it has to deliver something that the consumer wants and sees value in. If I could get like, I actually am really lucky because my husband loves to do laundry, and so that's one thing he does. I have a lot of other responsibilities at home, but he loves to run the washing machine. He doesn't even like me to touch it. But I think if it could fold things, that's adding value. Somebody's got to work on that. Like, how does it come out of the dryer and auto fold?
Oh, I had an idea for an invention. If anyone's listening, you stack the washing machine on top of the dryer, and when the wash is done, it just opens, drops in the dryer. Then you don't have to move anything. So
I like that idea.
It's probably a very good reason why that won't work. But anyway, I wrote down a very good question. You say, if anyone misses, I think that if you take away one thing from this podcast, fantastic question that Mary said, is it adding value for the customer? So I think that's true for our products. I think that's true for our marketing as well. So let's talk about, so we talked about some of the things you made, and that's, the How I Made It in Marketing podcast. Kind of one of the reasons for the name is I always felt like, yeah, it's how we made it successfully, but also like as marketers, we get to make things. So I've never really had another career, but I feel like you see a dentist or an accountant or these other jobs, they don't really walk away like, I made this, I made this thing, you made these things. And the other great thing we do though is we get to make things with people. We get to collaborate. We get to kind of all concept and brainstorm and learn together. And so let's talk about some of the people that you learned from. So we're going to start with Ron Diamond, the president and CEO of Conair LLC. And Conair is the parent company of Cuisinart. And you learned from Ron, you must remain wet clay. So how did you learn this from Ron?
Well, I mean, this is actually one of his mantras. I have my own mantra, but it's not.
What's your
it's
mantra?
so my my mantra is I'm a marketer, not a miracle worker.
I think everyone can relate to that one.
Yeah. So anyway, that's kind of my funny mantra. That's not like, I do the best I can. So Ron is the president and CEO of Cuisinart LLC, and I've been working with Ron. He's been here longer than I have, believe it or not, and which is really great. That's a stable leadership is fabulous if you ask me. But Ron always says, you have to remain wet clay. In other words, like you can't be, think of being a statue, right? You're like stuck in your ways. You don't move. You're immobile, and you are not willing to change. And because our world is changing so quickly, it doesn't matter what category you look at or what subject matter you look at. You have to constantly be taking in new information, being able to, be malleable. You know what I mean? Be able to still remain relevant and be changeable. Not change for change's sake, but understanding that in order to progress in the world, you still have to be able to think, take in new things, try new things. I think it's really important. I think that when you see people who get like that, like think, like I said, like the statue, like you're immobile, you basically become irrelevant. And that's how I perceive remaining wet clay.
Well, I think it's interesting because when you say that, when I hear that, I think the way some people do that in their careers, they just jump to the next role and the next role and the next role. They're always like, okay, the next role is going to solve all my problems. But staying where you have been, how have you done that within a role? Because I think you said Ron told you recently we need to blow things up a little. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, he said to me very recently, he goes, we need to blow things up. And it kind of goes along with the wet clay thing. In other words, like we need to evaluate our situation and how can we do things differently and how can we, not do things the same way all the time, the way we did it 5 years ago or 5 weeks ago. It's just really about self-evaluation, and looking at the business from kind of, as some people say, like the 35,000 foot view, right? But when they say that, sometimes I say, there's no oxygen up there. But basically, like looking at it from like, sometimes with what's going on in the working world right now, you're so task driven and focused on that you have to kind of step back and say, where are we going? Just because we did it this way doesn't mean that's the way we should be doing it for the future. And I agree with him. It's about evaluating the business at all the time. You're kind of always evaluating the business, and so there's things that we're going to be doing that will be blowing things up.
So kind of along that theme, the next lesson, find intellectual inspiration. I think that would probably go along with that. You learned that from Laura Schneck, the CEO of International Insights. So how did you learn that from Laura?
So Laura and I are working on this huge long-term project, and I started to realize when I was talking to Laura about the purpose of the project and what we wanted to do, what we wanted to learn, and at the end of it, I was realizing that I was thinking like on a functional, like, we're so feature and benefit oriented. What are we delivering to the consumer, And we were having conversations about like people's emotional state, like, because when consumers are going through a purchase journey or they're deciding on a product or purchase, what are they thinking about? Like, what is their emotional state? And then trying to get that out of how they attach it to our brand. And for me, it was really hard. It was like, how do I get from here to there? And, how do I get them to articulate that to us so in a meaningful way? And she really had some interesting methods to her madness and how she did that. And I just thought it was so inspiring. And also for myself, like, when you're working on a brand for so long, sometimes when people say to you things like, what's the essence of the brand, you're like, oh, and so working alongside of her, it's like showed me like a way of thinking that sometimes you end up over time detaching yourself from, and you don't realize it. And so when you're talking about serving customer and serving the consumer, at the end of the day, sometimes it gets functional, right? Instead of emotional. And then when you kind of look at our brand and how it like intertwines with family life and how consumers are like, what's the first thing they do when they get up in the morning, before or after they take a shower? They make a cup of coffee. And how, we're so like ingrained in some of their lives in some ways, but what's their emotional state when they're doing that? And how does that serve our brand too at the end of the day? So I thought that was really intriguing. It also shows that I'm definitely wet clay. I can still change my
Yeah,
thought process.
no, that's great because I think one of the hardest things to do, I think, not just as a marketer, but as a human being, is to see things through someone else's eyes. And so if you're working in a brand, if you're working at any company, you pour so much of your heart and soul into it, you live in those four walls, you kind of, you're on that team almost, right? You're on that team. And so to kind of just see it through dispassionate eyes and the customer's eyes is such a big challenge. So, like, what was one of the questions or two? You mentioned one thing, but you said she had these methods. You have like a question or two she asked that like, whoa, boom.
Yeah,
Really
like this I thought was so smart, and it was something she did on the fly because we were like working on these focus groups and we were having conversations. When you're working on focus groups, you're constantly talking about like what they said, what happened, and then she said she started to say to the participants like, if this brand was a music, what kind of music would it be? And so like articulating it in a different way, I thought was so interesting. And also then like if it was a personality, who would the personality be? And there was really distinctive thoughts between different brands. Obviously, we're not just looking at our own brand, we're looking at other brands too. Always do that. And so I thought that was super interesting. Like that's an automatic way to articulate something that shows emotion, but without like, it's hard to get to that level with consumers by just asking them the question. Like, so I thought it was interesting the way that she did it. And I thought it was brilliant personally.
It's almost like therapy in a sense, the way you get
Yeah,
into it. You
it's
know,
true.
consumer therapy. So when you said some of these things like you must remain wet clay and find intellectual inspiration, it got me thinking. Conair is a parent organization of Cuisinart. MechLabs Institute is a parent organization of Marketing Sherpa, and we've got a free digital marketing course. And the first section of that course, before we get into how to build a landing page or anything, it's about the marketer. And one of the sessions, the marketer self-image, it's all about, before you can optimize your marketing, you have to optimize yourself. And so like when you talk about things like you must remain wet clay, find intellectual inspiration, that's what I think of our self-image as marketers. Before we even get into the brand, before we do these things, what can we do for ourselves to optimize ourselves? So I think that's a kind of a great lesson and a great thing to focus on for everyone who gets off the podcast. So lastly, I want to talk about Mary George. She's an advisor of American Securities, which is the owner of Conair, as we talked about, the parent company of Cuisinart. And she's the former CEO of Bell Sports and a co-chairman of Bell Automotive Products. And you said you learned from her how to get education through mentorship. So how'd you learn that from Mary?
Well, we're working on a long-term project, and Mary is our key advisor. And the thing for me was that I had mentioned to you that like even though I've been in this business for a really long time in our categories, there don't tend to be a large group of women um, who are or have worked at the caliber that Mary has. And for me, it's super interesting though because she's really good at, she has a demeanor about her that's like really even keeled, and she kind of knows how to like get people involved. And I was explaining to you like what I've found myself that's been very difficult with working a hybrid schedule is, especially like hybrid, like we're on a consistent schedule, so we only see the same 50% of the people 50% of the time. So it's a lot harder to collaborate with people. Like some of the natural collaboration that happens when you're just like, making a cup of coffee and you run into somebody, or you go down the cafeteria to grab something to eat, and you sit down for a few minutes with somebody, and you talk about things like openly. She's been really good about saying things to me like, you should involve so and so more in the project. And the thing is that sometimes we're so overwhelmed with what we're doing, like on a daily, that you're just like, okay, I'm on a deadline with this, and I have to do this, this, and this is my long term, and this is how I get from here to there. And so, like, you're trying to move these things along because of the importance to the business. But sometimes, on the other hand, you kind of have to step back and say, how do I get, it's a kind of fine line between, having the right people involved and having too many people involved. There's a danger zone between the two of those. Like, you want to have the certain amount of input from the right people so they have ownership, but you don't want too many people involved who are going to muddy the waters and stagnate the entire program, whatever it happens to be. So she's done a really good job for me. Also, just reading people too. She's really good at reading people, like noticing like who's giving input and who isn't, and like I said, sometimes like when you're in the throes of it, like you're not necessarily, that's not registering.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's funny when you're saying that about how you were getting mentored. I wonder how you mentor others, because we were in one of the earlier episodes of the podcast, we interviewed Nazia Kamratz, and she told this great, really amazing story of how she was in the maternity ward, and she was on a client pitch call and like alarms were going off in the maternity ward on this client pitch call. And she's like, oh, that's just the sounds of Brooklyn. Don't pay attention to that. But the reason she was doing this is because she really kind of never had that mentor before saying, hey, like if you're in labor or whatever, it's okay to like kind of take a bit of a break. And so then kind of she had that mission of like kind of telling people in the future, hey, this is okay. This is what I've done. And now kind of you need to like take a break at certain times in your career because other people would want to help them out. So you talked about Mary mentoring you. Like what, how have you kind of taken that on and mentored your team from what you learned from Mary? Especially like you said, in this hybrid workforce, this weird environment where we're not always seeing each other in person.
Yeah, so a couple of things. Like I always say to people, like, sometimes like when you do those like annual reviews and they're like, we have like competencies like leadership, innovation, teaming. And it's like, I try to explain to young people, like they think of leadership, they think like somebody has to work for them, right? And I'm like, no, that's not
Yes.
leading. Any
Right.
person that you are in touch with, internally, externally, anytime you are guiding, educating, teaching, is leadership. It's basically like sometimes people don't even realize it. I'm like, you remember how you led that project and you worked with the outside teams and da, 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 and they're like,
You don't
oh
need an
yeah.
official title to be a leader.
No.
Everyone, when they're in, they're like, well, I want this title. I want to be a leader. Well, be a leader. Nobody's stopping you, right?
Yeah, no one's stopping you. And for me, I also like for my team, I feel like I'm constantly mentoring them. When I meet with them to set their goals for the year, I make it, I don't want to say requirement because then it sounds so kind of firm. Um, they have to pick something that's development oriented. Like it has to be one of their goals, and we discuss what it is because I want them to own it. So like, and I also do the same for myself. I'm doing a leadership course with CMOs with the ANA that starts actually tomorrow, the 5th, and it's a long-term it's a long-term leadership program. And so I feel like I'm constantly mentoring people. I also do some mentorship through the ANA with college students. They started that about a year ago, so I'll be doing that again this summer. And so, I mean, I think that I'm constantly doing it. I think the part that's hard though is making sure that I'm constantly making sure that I'm helping my people progress, whether they're here working with me or they choose to go work somewhere else. I think that the value that I add to it is my style of management, my leadership, and also the fact that I'm invested in them. And I saw, this is not my own quote, but I like it, so I'm borrowing it. Your team doesn't work for you; you work for your team, and I believe that's really true, because if you're not invested in them for the long term, and being able to like read them and understand when they're overloaded, or understand when they need a break, or understand that they have lives outside of here. They have, older parents, or they have young children, or, you have to have some empathy for that. And I think by showing that to them, that when they are maybe in a similar situation, they'll handle it the right way. That's my job. That's how I feel about it.
Well, that's great. Well, we certainly learned a lot from you today, Mary. I mean, I think one of the things that really hearing you talk to about how you're just constantly trying to learn and change and read articles and all these things. Hopefully a lot of people learn from you in this podcast as well. But let's leave them with this one final thought. What are the key qualities of an effective marketer?
A couple of things, I would say. So my personal situation is not the situation of my consumers. That's like number one to me. It's like,
Yes.
I think sometimes we personalize things, and so we have to like remember, like, I'm a focus group of one. I say the way I live and the things that are important to me. That's not the universe. That's just Mary Rodgers' perspective. But sometimes it comes in handy too, because I'm like, we're doing research projects. I'm like, you know what? I know that I wouldn't do that, so let's see if the consumer is thinking about that a different way, the same way, an alternate way. And so I think some of that does help me think about things in an alternate way. But on the other hand, like, you can't believe that you're the center of the universe and that everyone's just going to follow you to the end of the rainbow. That's not how it works. It's a lot harder than that.
Very good point. Very good point. And, I think, like I said earlier, that's kind of the biggest challenge in life, to realize that we could be very different from the people we're trying to sell to. I've said kind of before in the podcast, but when I started as a copywriter right out of college, I was writing for these multi-million-dollar third and fourth home ski and ski out condos in like Vale Valley and Bachelor Gulch Village. And, I remember pitching an idea to my boss of something having to do with, them sleeping in and, enjoying the day or whatever. And he said, these are the titans of industry. They're up, before the markets are open in Japan or whatever, and they're, up at like 5 a.m. And as me, someone right out of college who, like, to me, I thought success would be being able to sleep in. So different. So I think that's such an important thing to remember, is we're not our customers. How can we learn from them? And one way, and I'm going to ask you one final question about what music are you, because one way you did it in your focus group, you asked, what music are your customers, or what music would your brand be? So if you were a brand, Mary, what music would you be? I would be Pearl Jam. I know that. What music would you be?
I would be Andre Bocelli, but in Italian, because I study Italian too. So I listen to a lot of Italian music. So like in my kitchen and stuff like that. And I have been studying Italian for like 10 years, but still not 100% fluent, but I'm always working towards it. And I also believe that's another thing, that you have to make sure that you're feeding your personal passions. I know you asked about music, but on the other hand, like, I love to cook, and, my husband, I love to hike, and I love to travel. And so I also think that that's been tough on people the last couple of years, because they've kind of not been able to do all of those things that maybe fill them up inside, And so I would also say that keep that in mind too.
Yeah, and that will come out in our creativity. Well, you're far classier than I, Mary. Thank you for joining us today.
Doubtful.
Thanks so much for being here, and thanks to everyone for listening. I hope you learned a lot from this conversation with Mary. I know I sure did.
Thank you for joining us for How I Made It in Marketing with Daniel Burstein. Now that you've gotten inspiration for transforming yourself as a marketer, get some ideas for your next marketing campaign from Marketing Sherpa's extensive library of free case studies at marketingsherpa.com. That's marketingsherpa.com.